Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Perry World House. I'm Marie Harf, the Executive Director here at Perry World House. Welcome to our last public event of the semester. It's crazy to think about how fast it's gone, but we have a lot coming up next semester, so please keep looking at the emails you get and looking at our website. We're so thrilled today to welcome three distinguished panelists onto the stage here at Perry World House. As we've talked about a lot this semester, this year, nearly 2 billion people, more than ever before, were eligible to perform their basic democratic right, casting a vote in elections. In countries including Indonesia, Mexico, the United Kingdom, India, and more recently, Georgia, Moldova, and of course, the United States. Media played a key role in framing the issues, candidates, and parties at the heart of these elections. Yet in many cases, reporting lacked the independence, objectivity, and accuracy essential to a meaningful democratic process. Today, our speakers will explore the principles that undergird a democratic media, reflect on the media's performance in the elections of 2024, and point the way to meaningful change and reform. Let me introduce them to you now. Des Freedman is a professor of media and communications at Goldsmiths, University of London. He's the author of books including The Politics of Media Policy, The Contradictions of Media Power, Misunderstanding the Internet, and the forthcoming Capitalism and the Media. He writes on media for Declassified UK and led the 2016 inquiry into the future of public service television, chaired by the film producer David Putman, and is a founding member of the UK Media Reform Coalition and co-organizer of the annual Media Democracy Festival. He is also a Perry World House visiting fellow this year. Carol Giacomo is chief editor of Arms Control Today, the Arms Control Association's flagship publication. She was a member of the New York Times editorial board from 2007 until 2020. This is when I got to know her and work with her, writing opinion pieces about all major national security issues, including nuclear weapons, Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. She also served as diplomatic correspondent for Reuters in Washington, covering foreign policy for the International Wire Service for over 2 decades. Her work involved regular overseas travel, including to North Korea, Iran, and Myanmar. And she met half a dozen times with President Obama at the White House and interviewed scores of other world leaders. Over the past few years, she has also taught at leading higher education institutions, including Princeton, Harvard, and my alma mater, Indiana University, although not at Penn yet. We will have to correct that. Our moderator today is someone I think most of you are familiar with, Dean Sarah Benet Weiser. She is the Walter H. Annenberg Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication here at Penn, and it's Lauren Berlant Professor of Communication. In addition, she is a research professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and the founding director of the Center for Collaborative Communication at the Annenberg Schools. Her teaching and research interests include gender in the media, identity, citizenship and cultural politics, consumer culture and popular media, race and the media, and intersectional feminism. She is also the co-lead of our democracy pillar, our thematic research pillar here at Perry World House, which we stood up at the start of this academic year and has proved to be even more important as we've looked at global trends and events over the past several months. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Marie, for that wonderful and thorough introduction. And because it was so thorough, and we only have an hour, and we have 2 amazing people here to talk to us about democracy and media, I'm really going to hold you both to Marie's final promise that you're going to point the way, just all the ways to the future. Without further ado, Des Freedman, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Sarah, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Perry World House for bringing me all the way from London, and I hope to learn a lot, because these are, I don't know what the word is, exciting, that's a very glib way of putting it. These are challenging times. As you've heard, this was supposed to be the most democratic year ever, and yet, to me, that's not exactly how it feels. Of course, there's always the banal statement that democracy is messy, but I don't think that mess is the problem. What I want to do is talk about both threats to and a lack of democracy in a whole host of countries, importantly, including ones that are usually labeled as liberal democracies. And these threats, I assume that was not me. And these threats and deficits relate to the proliferation of media dysfunctions that we're going to focus on today. And my role is to not talk about the US, but for anyone who is feeling slightly under the weather at the moment because of what's going on, please don't think that my bringing an international perspective to this debate is necessarily going to make you feel any better. And I apologize for that in advance. And the reason for that is because we're surrounded by very disturbing global trends that affect media systems in different ways in different countries. But these are not uncommon across the globe. Things like digital repression, misinformation, the normalization of lying, and the seemingly unfettered power of money and influence. So what I want to do in 10 minutes, and I'm afraid I probably will take up the 10 minutes till Sarah shuts me up, is to talk a little more about these media dysfunctions that I see as both the product of broader democratic deficits and at the same time triggers for the further deterioration of democracy. So let's first address the technological elephant in the room, because I lost track, as I'm sure you did, of the number of articles that I read at the beginning of this election year, saying that this was going to be the year of the AI election, and that presumably formerly pristine democratic processes were going to be undermined by deepfake misinformation. AI was identified in this year's World Economic Forum's Global Risk Perception Survey as, I find this incredible, call me naive, AI was defined as the second most pressing risk after extreme weather, well ahead of things like, very unimportant things like the cost of living, armed conflicts, political polarization. In the UK, the security services publicly warned about AI-created hyper-realistic bots that were going to disrupt the election when, and I don't mean to be facetious, but the only bots that I saw in the UK general election were the political candidates themselves reading from pre-arranged scripts and totally failing to grip the population. And it's very interesting that in so many of the countries who went to the polls this year, turnout in virtually all of them fell because of a lack of interest. Very complicated situation, but I think interesting. Now, I'm not saying that there's nothing to worry about in relation to AI or in relation to the abuses carried out by big tech more generally. That's just one example. There was real concern last year about AI in relation to the Slovakian election, which was used, where AI was used to discredit the pro-EU, pro-European candidate in favor of what turned out to be the successful pro-Moscow candidate. Now, of course, AI was used in elections across the globe this year, but to suggest that it was key in persuading people to vote in a particular way, to change their vote, is to ignore, and I suspect this is the point of people making such a big deal of it, it's to ignore a whole host of other more basic, enduring political and socio-economic factors. The boring things like inflation, wage freezes, they're not as exciting as talking about AI. The British-based Alan Turing Institute just concluded that there was, quote, no evidence that AI-enabled disinformation or deepfakes meaningfully impacted UK or European election results. And to be honest, I'm much more concerned. I'm not complacent about AI, but realistically at the moment, I'm more concerned about the level of government control of information channels you see in places like Indonesia, where state repression of online content reached new levels in a crucial election year. I'm more concerned about that than I am at the moment about deepfakes destroying democracy. Secondly, there is, of course, a very serious problem with the fragmentation of social media and how this has cemented polarization and destroyed shared spaces and the possibility of consensus on particular issues. So, for example, TikTok was vital for circulating formerly Defense Minister Prabowo's new cuddly image in Indonesia. He won the election. There was something like 19 billion views of the AI-generated cartoon used to manufacture his image. In India, YouTube was very important in spreading misogynistic hate speech. But TikTok didn't invent silos. YouTube did not invent disinformation. These platforms and their abuses that they are associated with are the latest products of what I see as asymmetrical information environments that fundamentally lack accountability and oversight. They feed off disillusion and despair with traditional media voices, cynically exploiting real anger and often branding themselves, as you know, as anti-establishment, despite being owned by pillars of the, whether they're pillars or not, but they're owned by giant corporations. You can't reduce polarization to a question of technology when it's also the outcome of a breakdown in political consensus. Third, it's far too soon to write off traditional legacy media and news sources. Of course, it's true that consumption patterns are changing very fast, but I don't buy what Musk says about saying goodbye to the legacy media. For him, that's ultimately self-serving rather than analytically precise. And again, it's a very complicated picture of consumption. The fact is, though, and I'm particularly thinking about the UK election, TV remains very influential in many countries, particularly amongst older voters who are still the people most likely to turn out to vote. So in Britain, it was by far the most, television was by far the most influential source. Something like 49% of people depended on it, as opposed to 26% for social media. And of course, even in social media, traditional legacy news makes up a significant amount of the content. So Musk can claim, as he did on X, that X is the #1 news source in the UK. My eyes kind of popped out because, would you believe it, it's not true. X is the 10th most most popular news source. So I don't think we are yet in a situation where traditional media power, and therefore traditional media moguls and traditional media sources, have been completely overturned forever. I just think they have been outmaneuvered because of their own failures to recognize and to successfully address widespread anger. Fourth, if we're talking about the continuing significance of legacy news on voting behavior, we have to talk about a media business model in many countries that rewards comment, scandal, gossip, and of course, and I put it in inverted commas, charisma, however you want to define that in the age of Modi, Trump, and Milei in Argentina. I am not including my own Prime Minister Keir Starmer in the list of people with charisma. And the fact is that elections are great, and elections are profitable for the media. They're great for the bottom line, if not for deliberative democracy. Fifth, election campaigns, as we know, are more and more marked by anti-democratic, horse race-obsessed forms of coverage, which talks much more about, as we now know, imprecise polls and big personalities than about precise policies. Again, in the UK, scandalously, 42% of all broadcast coverage, which, as I've said, was very influential in how people voted, 42% was dominated by stories about the electoral process, while issues central to the population was marginalized. Two examples. The parties, not surprisingly, didn't want to talk too much about how to meet net zero commitments, but that is no justification for the fact that climate stories occupied just 2% of all election coverage. And while the UK's government's support for Israel's war on Gaza remains a major concern for millions of voters in the UK, and actually led to the election of 5 members of parliament specifically standing on pro-Palestinian platforms, it barely featured in the election campaign, which, to the extent it did talk about security issues, was all about NATO, which is not on the lips of most British people at the moment. And what I also think is very interesting is the campaign itself totally disengaged people. It literally turned them off. The people who were already least likely to vote became even less likely to vote the more the election campaign went on. Now, have I got 3 more minutes? In the light of these variables, talking about a democratic media doesn't feel to me like an accurate description of a system that, while formally free, is in reality subject to the strategic interests and sometimes the whims of giant organizations, individual moguls, or the state, as in the case of countries with public service models as well. And while I think that all these issues that I've touched on are very relevant to coverage of elections across the globe, I also think that focusing on the media too much, even though this is, I guess, the reason why I've been invited here, focusing on the media risks obscuring a bigger problem. And that concerns the kind of democracy, the very understanding of democracy that is present even in the so-called stable democracies. This is a definition I read from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, contrasting, quote, stable democracies from consolidated autocracies. And I think that is a kind of complacent distinction that needs much more untangling for me. Because actually, even talking about so-called democratic elections has a strange ring to it, because for me, elections are increasingly today anemic, fragile, pallid expressions of democracy. Of course, I don't want it to be like that. Elections should be places where genuine differences are thrashed out, where campaign promises are actually linked to actions that follow. I think modern elections are often the opposite of that. They are spectacles run by some of the most wealthy organizations and interests in society that take place parallel to the real exercise of power, so often located in giant towers, boardrooms, or opaque offices of the state. The British journalist, who's a campaign journalist called Paul Foot, wrote a wonderful book called The Vote, which was about two things. One, it was about how the franchise was won in Britain over the course of centuries. But he also spoke towards the end about, quote, the thin gruel of democracy that elections offer us. And he called for extending democracy. He called for economic and industrial democracy as well as parliamentary democracy. In other words, not simply formal rights to take part in irregular elections, but an understanding of democracy connected to popular control of everyday spheres, including work, the state, and civil society. And I think that's a much more expansive conception of democracy than the one which governs our political systems. It's one that sees the public not just as occasional voters, but as regular participants in how their lives are structured. I think that's very different to the kind of democracy we see in a much more hollowed out environment. So in conclusion, we need big conversations about democracy. And it's not enough to think that we in the US or Western Europe have the perfect or even relevant or even sole institutional models when our versions of democracy have been found wanting. We need desperately to explore other approaches, which is precisely what Perry Worldhouse is trying to do with its new democracy program. And that goes for the media as well. I don't think there are any shortcuts to the thoroughgoing change we need to construct democratic media. And asking the brokers of democracy to do it for us will not work. In the light of the unprecedented corporate and state power, just calling for better algorithms isn't going to do it. Hoping that existing legislative structures will change given the threats of capture won't do it. Media freedom initiatives pursued by governments who have already liberalized their communications environments won't do it either. We need to conceive of democratic media in a whole new way, as distinct not only from the propaganda of authoritarian regimes, but also from the contemporary so-called liberal media that I see as rooted either in a meek and defensive public service that I have in my country and in parts of Europe, or as related to the aggressive market entrepreneurialism and libertarian individualism we see so dramatically here in the US. If we don't do this, we are going to see the dysfunctions that I mentioned at the start continue and thrive to the detriment of any prospect for real democracy. Thank you.
Okay, Carol.
Well, now you'll see the difference between a professor who has a speech all written out and a journalist who has notes on a piece of paper. But we do cover, our takes are very different, and mine, I hope, is a little bit more at a granular level. Democracy can't exist without facts. Voters can't make sound decisions about the people they elect to lead them and the issues that are important to them if they don't have access to trustworthy news and information. And beyond that, this affects not just who you choose for your leaders, but the state of the economy. It has an effect on business, on the health and clarity of the economy, security, weather. It cuts across all sorts of aspects of our life. And if we're not starting with the same information, the sort of place where we can look for common facts, or common agreement of facts and thereby find consensus on complicated issues, we are going to be in trouble. And tragically, we are in an era when facts do exist. There's more information and more access to information than ever before, but people can't always find it. Sometimes they don't want to find it, or they don't know whether to trust it if they do find it. Our politics here in the United States, and I'm going to be speaking specifically about the United States, over the last 8 years, and especially this year's presidential election, has shown how ignorance and bad information, especially pernicious disinformation and propaganda, can poison our discourse and produce outcomes that have put the country on a perilous course. Trump lied so often, people grew numb to it, and he convinced the Republican Party and millions of Americans to go along with the flood of falsehoods. Russian and other foreign entities flooded our social media with twisted perceptions, bots. There was one case I knew of an altered AI video that became an issue in the election. But to your point, Des, I don't think AI was not the driving factor. Elon Musk turned Twitter into a pro-Trump propaganda machine and opened the door wide to right-wing extremists. Going forward, the information space is obviously a prime battlefield as we try to hang on to a country in which people choose their leaders by ballot and live under the rule of law, however flawed the system may be. And I concede for sure that it is flawed and needs reform. The space is complicated these days as legacy media, and by legacy media, I mean the New York Times and the big television networks and the Post and Wall Street Journal and the like, competes and often is supplanted by social media sites, Substack, podcasts, and YouTube. Arguably, there are many right-wing media organizations such as Fox and Newsmax and the like that are having a big impact on setting the agenda for information in this country. But reporting facts takes time and money, and lots of news outlets, as you are aware, have gone out of business. And particularly at the local level, I think this has been not just a tragedy, but it is it's weakening our democracy because people have, less and less clarity about what's going on in their communities. Meanwhile, many Americans are more furious than ever about the legacy media. The New York Times has obviously been a prime target of that, but so are the Washington Post and the LA Times, both of which pulled back on endorsing Kamala Harris. The Times did endorse Harris, but the Post and the LA Times both had editorials prepared to endorse Harris, and their publishers, right at the last minute, basically decided to pull off the endorsements, which is an extremely worrisome thing, especially since Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, his space company, the competitor to SpaceX, met with Trump. I think it was either the day that the editorial was pulled or the day after. Meanwhile, Trump is denigrating journalists as enemies of the people and threatening retribution against many of the most prominent media companies. And this is obviously a serious concern. A.G. Sulzberger, who is publisher of the New York Times, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post recently in which he talked about what could happen if Trump comes after the news media here. The Times has already been sued by, Trump sued the New York Times recently, but there was a judgment against Trump. He had to pay the paper $400,000, but that still takes a lot of time and money to fight those kinds of attacks. But people are obviously worried about them. Just as one example, I don't know if you watch Morning Joe on MSNBC, but Mika Brzezinski and Joe Scarborough were very strong critics of Trump and called him fascist on their broadcast. And then a couple of days ago, they went and had a meeting with him at Mar-a-Lago and made up. And, there's been a lot of pushback, criticism of them for doing that and for being, for kowtowing. And Trump responded to Scarborough spoke about their meeting in rather kind terms, felt it was constructive, saw it as a way to kind of move forward with covering his administration. And then Trump put out a post on his Truth Social today and basically said, Scarborough begged me for the meeting and he was just like a dog. I mean, it was quite a pushback. Anyway, I don't have, no one really has a quick and dirty answer for how we operate in this environment where the information universe is so atomized. But I'm so glad to hear what Des said about not throwing away the legacy media, which is really sort of a knee-jerk reaction of a lot of people these days. I too am critical of a lot of the things that legacy media has done in this election and in general, but it remains, and despite the economic problems, journalism at its best, newspapers, televisions, radio stations, magazines that are operated by professional journalists who have an ethics standard and who really do see their role as a public service and take seriously the role that the media has in a democratic society. I mean, we're in the First Amendment. We are protected under the First Amendment because the founding fathers thought a free media was so important. So I think we have to take the best of what legacy media has to offer, and there are ways, there are ideas floating around about how to strengthen it. Certainly, and I go back to the Times partly because I know it so well, but also because it's it may be the most successful legacy media standing right now. I mean, it has diversified. It's gotten into podcasts. It's created other platforms to try to bring readers in and meet them where, meet the young people where they're living these days, which is on their phone and on podcasts. But there's a lot more that we're going to have to do as we meet the challenge of a world in which there's going to be a man in the White House who is a demigod, who believes rules don't apply to him, and he's going to push the limit as far as he can.
Okay, well, thank you both. You both ended on such hopeful notes. I'm not really sure where to go from here. I want to make sure that we have a lot of time for questions from the audience. I know we have a big group on Zoom as well. But one thing that I was really struck with by listening to both of you, and thank you both for those really important and thorough interventions, is, how, Des, you began with saying this is messy. And I think that it is messy. I also think that there's been a lot of kind of singular focus on particular issues that you both kind of brought out, whether or not it's AI or getting out the vote or the election itself or charisma. And it's clear that the sort of moment of crisis that we are in right now is more a cultural crisis, I think, than a political crisis. At least both of them are kind of existing side by side. And so it feels like to me that for me as a scholar of culture, one of the things that has always motivated me is the promise of reimagination, and that we can reimagine different ways of understanding information. We can reimagine what our media platforms might look like. So, we can reimagine how people might engage with the media, what it means to kind of challenge gatekeeping, to challenge autocratic, kind of systems, mechanisms for owning the media, billionaires who own our media platforms. And so I'm wondering if that strikes either of you as well. Is there a place for reimagination of media? And I'm certainly not asking you to do all that reimagining here, because that wouldn't be very nice. But I think that there are so many. We see if you read the paper or the different papers, or you're on social media right now. There's so many diagnoses of what happened. So many, and kind of trying to sift through all of those diagnoses to figure out, like, what is the one thing I think is a mistake? There are many, many things. And I think trust is at the core of it, right? And in order to regain trust in any kind of media, we need to, I think, reimagine some of its mechanisms. So I wondered if you had thoughts about that.
Such a huge question. Do you want to go first?
I think that's happening. I think that's happening in some places. I don't know. I mean, the publisher of the LA Times, who's a scientist, a doctor and a scientist who sort of took on the paper. He's very wealthy, and he bought the paper several years ago and saved it, but he did not come from the journalism world, so he's got a very different perspective. At any rate, people were very angry when he pulled the editorial on endorsing in this election. And now he's out there saying, basically, we've got to reimagine things, and we've got to bring more voices in. And I mean, but the question is, what does it mean? Does it mean false equivalency? If it's false equivalency, then that's not truth. Okay, that's not fact gathering. That's bending backwards to make two things seem the same that really aren't. If it's bringing in, I don't know, more disparate political views. I'm talking political space now because the election was in that context, or economic views or whatever. I'm not an expert on the LA Times, so I can't really tell you where I would see the weaknesses there. But in general, that's a perfectly good thing. And the New York Times actually made an effort to do that, certainly on the opinion side several years ago. And one could argue, have they gone too far? Because, if they really do, like today, there's a piece about in which somebody is arguing to throw out all the criminal cases against Trump. I mean, you could argue, yes, maybe an article like that makes sense. You need to hear that argument. But some other people might think that that's really not where we should be focusing our attention right now, because there are other threats from him that need to be sort of pushed back against. So, and I would say there are also a lot of organizations that have started podcasts or media entities. The Bulwark, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Bulwark. It was founded by former Republicans who, the minute Trump got elected, just said, we can't go with this guy. And they sort of set up this outfit. They have a number of podcasts. They do a component where they have done focus groups, like all the time. They're doing focus groups all around the country so that they were able to, I mean, this is one operation that actually is doing its own research so that at least they could say, we have talked to, 1,000 people, and this is how they see these issues. That's what's important to them. So some people are trying to do new things.
Thank you for the question, because I spend most of my waking life trying to reimagine the media, because without reimagination, I don't know why you'd wake up. But I'm not going to spend or waste your time going through those. And there are people in this room who are also committed to that research. But what I think is that unless we deal with some of the barriers, some of the constraints on the kind of media we want to see, which will do the job that you sketched out, then I think, the kinds of small initiatives, maybe significant ones, but they will remain marginal unless we deal with huge concentrations of wealth that dominate the media across the world, unless we deal with a real authoritarianism, which is both vested in governments but also in private control of the media, unless we find ways, which is not through just polite small regulatory reforms, because they will be the result of wider movements that take on board the lack of democracy that we feel. Unless we have that kind of ambition, I'm worried we will just be stuck with very small and largely, uninfluential moves. So it's a great question, but we have to tackle what is stopping us from actually changing things.
Yeah, and I think that both, though, can exist at the same time. Smaller initiatives and then big reforms that are actually tackling the issue of ownership and consolidation and wealth, and the ways in which those have become the kind of logic of media platforms. And so I think both small initiatives, thinking, and maybe this is self-preservation. I wake up every day also trying to reimagine and think about, like, what can I do that's concrete, to think about the media and to change, to not go in the traditional direction of, here's what the problem is, let's just fix it in an already established analytical framework and think differently, right?
I obviously agree that you have to do both at the same time. But let me give one example: fact-checking. Now, fact-checking is wonderful, and given the lies that are told, fact-checking is important. But unless you deal with the reasons why lies are being told and tolerated, then then the fact-checking will just be almost a waste of time. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying let's deal with the fact that we have a system that rewards telling lies. That, for me, is the bigger question.
I agree. It's not about tinkering with a system that is already established and just making slight adjustments. It's about challenging the system, challenging the structural logic on which the system rests, and so on. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience, because I could continue this conversation all day long, and you don't need to hear that.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to have all three of you on a stage together. And I'm really grateful for this space to be thinking about these things. My question is about finding the right intervention points then. Because there's sort of catch-22, especially that I'm hearing in the different perspectives between the two of you. We need a different media system, and we also need broader both cultural and political shifts to be able to even accomplish that. And so there's this catch-22 of, like, the media influences the political imaginary and what people are able to conceive of in terms of change that can be made at the systemic and cultural level. But also, like, if we don't have that first, then the media systems aren't going to change. And so I'm curious where you think the kind of key intervention points are, and what combination of levels of intervention are maybe most fruitful in terms of thinking about, like, operating at the level of like individuals, catalyzing individuals through opportunities that are maybe generating, like, a hunger for a deeper democracy, or intervening on media systems through regulation on funding or things like that. So, like, where is the key intervention point to resolve this sort of catch-22? Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you want me to? All right. Well, you wouldn't, thank you for the question. There's obviously not one answer because there will be multiple intervention points depending on where you are. If you're in Indonesia, then you are faced with increasing state repression using a whole range of different instruments, very new instruments, which are directly related to the suppression of speech online, but also using the police law, as well as old-fashioned media legislation to clamp down on what can be said. But it's very hard to think of, I don't think we should, we have to recognize the connections. One of the legitimations for what's happening in Indonesia is because there's particular pro-independence movements in one of the regions, Papua, and that there is severe repression on those people. And so the media then become wrapped up in it. So it's not, you know, I speak as someone who helped found the British media reform movement, and I spend most of my time saying, you know, media reform is too narrow. I don't know why I even bothered doing it in the first place, but I know it's because you have to hook up with other forces for change. And so I think if I was in Indonesia, it would be those pro-democracy forces as well as journalist organizations saying that, identifying that key point of repression and control, which is crucial for so many groups. I think if I was in the US, it would be clearly targeting the fact that, you know, there is absolutely no restrictions on wealth being used to manipulate public communication systems. So to have a free media, and I'm very uncomfortable with, you know, when people just say our democracy or free media, I think we need to do a little bit more work on these, because how can you have a free media if one man can buy what seems to be one of the most influential platforms without any, and I mean literally any, restrictions on what he's able to state, including what you think might be expected, which is to tell the truth. So I would say that that is absolutely critical for American citizens. In Britain, it's tricky. There are, you know, there's online harms acts which are having contradictory influences. They are both suppressing speech that the government does not wish to hear, as well as speech that is harmful to children, for example. But there's also a bigger argument, which some people here have heard me talk about before, and I apologize, you know, the challenging public service media. The BBC, for many of you, might be seen as something refreshing. I think it's another way of suppressing what I want to have as open and free speech, because the BBC is still too close to government. So for me, that is a key intervention point, is to rethink, reimagine what public media should be by arguing for structural reform, even of something like the BBC. And you people in here will be thinking, there are many worse organizations in the world than the BBC, but that's the organization I face up to. It's the main source of news in Britain. So that's my key intervention point.
Can I make a comment? We've already had an intervention in this country, and it's the marketplace. And the marketplace has pulled away from legacy media, whether it's TV and newspapers, whatever. And it has shown a great interest in podcasts, YouTube videos, everything, whatever, all that stuff out there. And and so, you know, you're getting much more of an atomization of media, the media message and media control. There's also going to be another intervention because Trump has promised, and his choice for the FCC has promised that there will be action coming from the FCC, possibly to revoke licenses for some of the television stations. So, and so we've got those two pressure points that are already underway. If you're looking for something else to do more structural reform that's more coherent and more centralized, Congress isn't going to do it because, you know, they're divided now. And I mean, they're really divided now. But it's not like it isn't happening. And I mean, what is your goal? I guess what's your goal? If you're looking for some place to intervene, what would be the goal? That would help you identify what the spot is.
Yeah, I would just say too that points of intervention, we're not usually invited to them, right? So, I mean, we need to figure out how to make space for ourselves. No one's going to invite us in to change the system.
You mean like the unwelcome guests?
We are definitely unwelcome guests at the media party. So thinking about different spaces where it might not be a kind of typical fit or a typical direction that you would go in, those might be the places where we can think about some of these interventions, both small and larger ones. Okay, we have a Zoom question.
Hi, thank you all so much for this talk this morning. And this question is more for Carol. You had mentioned the First Amendment. And with the Project 2025 playbook, there is a paragraph about the deletion of words like reproductive health, diversity, equity, and inclusion that interfere with First Amendment rights that should be deleted from legislation. And with that, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the future of news media relative to the First Amendment, if conversations about navigating possible challenges to that have been happening. Would just love to hear more about your perspective.
Well, that was about deleting those kinds of.
Usually.
I'm sorry. That was a reference was to deleting those words in government documents, right? I mean, that wouldn't affect. Are you saying that the media would somehow be influenced by, or should be influenced by the government if they say that that's what they're going to do for themselves? That would not affect the news media under the First Amendment. I mean, if they could try, but they wouldn't get away with that.
Thanks. So do we have one Zoom question?
Thank you guys so much. I'm really interested in the idea of possibility through this conversation around endorsements. Weirdly enough, we can see how people responded to the peeling back of these like political economic layers and ownership that I think kind of are kind of less paid attention to on the day-to-day with like buying up newspapers. But I think people were really interested in like how these owners played a part in decision making. What is the role of the editorial in a world where fewer people know or care, really arguably like naturalizing these ownership structures? And like what kinds of work could this endorsement moment, not the particular endorsement, but the moment where people are actually paying attention to political economy in the news, what could that do to like push the public to think more critically about the stakes of ownership, the stakes of organizing, and kind of keep political economy in the conversation?
I'm sorry, let me make sure I understand the question. What role could an editorial play in shaping the debate about ownership of the paper?
I'm interested in your thoughts on the discourse around peeling back the layers of how decisions are made in newspapers and how these ownership structures actually do play a part in like both the culture and the economics of what newspapers do and for whom.
I think more transparency is better. I think more transparency is essential because people don't trust the media, at least, or trust is very low. And so how do you regain that trust? And I think explaining what what our work is and how we go about it, being more forthright about identifying sources is when that's possible is a good thing. I think that I have a mixed feeling about reporters becoming so well known for their name, that they become a brand. And I mean, I come from, I'm old school, and I come from the world where, you're the journalist, you go do the work, and you let your work and your byline stand for yourself. But that is stand for itself. But, today there's certainly I don't know if it's pressure, is part of its pressure, part of its whatever, that more and more journalists are developing public persona. And so I have my point on this is that I have mixed feelings about it. But to the extent that if you don't read the newspaper, but you can see a journalist on television and their discussion of an issue tells you more about them and how they go about it, and if you detect sincerity and professionalism, maybe that's a good thing, because personal contact is a way to build trust. And so, people in Washington whom I covered for years, if I had a relationship with them that lasted, we generally, they generally trusted me that I would do a good job, and I wouldn't, my intentions were good. But somebody out in Indiana who doesn't know me might read the story and say, oh, this is, full of baloney. So, but to your specific point about the editorial, the publishers are the publishers. They're the ones who own the paper, and they're the ones who can decide whether or not editorials, what it says, and if it runs or not. The best publishers have a really good relationship with their editorial board, and there's a dialogue, and so there are no surprises, and you wouldn't get to that point. So there was a breakdown in the process. The publisher just, he made a decision he was going to overrule his people, which I thought was awful.
Well, I'd like to thank Jeff Bezos, because I think he has done what I probably tried to do for decades of trying to teach political economy. He did it in one instruction. That's what political economy is all about, stripping away all the mystique and saying, this is how power is manifest through my ownership of a particular organization. I'd like to thank the people who made Succession, because again, some of us in this room have been obsessed with Rupert Murdoch and have been campaigning for years. And then you have Succession, which strips away, just exposes what that kind of power, media power involves. And for me, it's quite a long way from the understanding of democracy that I have. So we have the notion of free media, of our democracy, seems to run against the fact that you have these giant enterprises who are not subject to any meaningful scrutiny through the forms of ownership that take place. And okay, again, it is different in different countries. The US is a particularly stark embodiment of a deregulated situation, but the question of ownership is critical wherever it is. If it is state ownership, just suppressing alternate views is one way, but as we can see, market ownership and concentrated market ownership is another way of generating a monopoly of views as well. So yeah, I mean, political economy is now something I hope, maybe it's not what people talk about over their dinner in Ohio, but they probably understand it a lot clearer now. And it's crucial because it matters what kind of ownership there is. If there is chain ownership, if there is, hedge fund ownership, this is a big deal in Britain at the moment. These are people without any vestiges of interest in kind of the public service concept. It makes a difference as to whether you are likely to have a local media outlet in a region where, it may not be that profitable. That's why we get more news desert. So thank you to these media moguls who have dramatized for us the power and ownership.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question from Zoom.
All right. So it says an issue that we're seeing with youth. Oh, it went away. One sec. Sorry. An issue we're seeing with youth is a lack of critical thinking, especially a lack of literacy from COVID disruptions to education. Is there a role in media, both legacy media and new media, in developing complex critical thinking in its consumers? If so, what would that look like?
Can I address that?
Yes.
First of all, I would say I don't think that there's a lack of critical thinking in our youth.
Hear, hear.
I would start with that. I understand why that could be a perception, but I think that one of the things that we have become so much more adept at is critically reading the media, even in this morass of AI and deep fakes and misinformation, that we are readers of the media. I think that all of these kinds of things that you both have discussed, these are things that we need to teach in our classes. We need to, offer as part of our curriculum. That ownership, market ownership, actually equals control and power, that it's not just a free market idea, that it controls information, that there are suppressive ownership that controls information. And to think, again, it's not about a specific TikTok video as much as it is about understanding the conditions under which those TikTok videos make sense to us. And that's where I think we need to kind of focus our efforts in terms of education.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I was just about to say that's a harsh question, and it presupposes that disengaging from legacy media is in itself a kind of marker of illiteracy. I mean, I think it's, for some of the reasons we've been outlining, it's actually quite understandable, because if you are younger, you look at the legacy media and think, well, thanks a bunch. Look at what you've left us with all your long traditions and your beautiful separation between editorial and advertising. Oops, that isn't the case. So it may not be a decision I necessarily share, but if you are moving away from, if you're moving to much more image-based forms of, I'm looking at you as the embodiment of this question, sorry, it's the laptop. I understand that. They want more dramatic. Maybe it's entirely intelligent to trust, only for now, image-based reporting, because maybe you think that is less likely to be tainted. I mean, unfortunately, AI is likely to put pay to that in the next however long. So I think youth are the most direct, most visible expressions of the changes in consumption. But I think that has broken apart the kind of complacency, which I think is what got us into this trouble in the first place. So again, it forces us to examine what democracy means, and we should expect change. Otherwise, what are we doing?
Well, I think we should expect a change. Otherwise, what are we doing is a perfect way to end this session. And to thank Des and Carol for your amazing comments and knowledge. And thank you all for coming.